Welcome everybody, thank you guys for joining us here at Howler Bike Park for the 2024 EMTB Shootout Series presented by Fox Racing and Schwalbe Tires. Today we're going to be checking out the Propain Ekano 2 CF Ultimate, a very fun and pretty interesting bike. So let's get into the details and see how it does.
Yes, this is the Propain Ekano 2 CF Ultimate, $9,999, and with a very interesting build spec, heavy on the SRAM with their new Eagle Powertrain drive system, full exo-axis T-type transmission, giving you the auto shift possibilities in that rear. And then, SRAM code brakes, full RockShox suspension, 170mm rear travel, 180 up front, and mixed wheels, how we have it. Although they do offer the option also to go for a full 29er setup. If you go to their website, which is the only way that you can order them because they are direct to consumer, you can go on there, start off with one of the standard builds, and then customize most of the components, choose from a few different frame colors, change a graphic color and stuff. Really nice to have. It's not quite as extensive as some of the other customization programs out there, but they definitely offer plenty of options to let you get the build dialed in to your preferences. This is a beast. The SRAM Eagle Powertrain, this is the only unit that we have on test. It's got 90 Newton meters of torque and 680 watts of peak power. And then with that aggressive geometry and the long travel, it's quite impressive. They managed to take this thing in at just 51.5 pounds. Yeah, certainly aggressive geometry as well. How has that been feeling for you so far?
Certainly the Geo's interesting, the drive unit's interesting. Obviously with the power claims, before we get into Geo, I would just like to say that numbers don't always add up to the performance. In my opinion, out on the trail, there were bikes that I thought felt much more powerful, even if they had a lower number rating. This thing for me definitely shined most power, most speed on lower gradient climbs, and then once it really started to get up and steep, I felt it dropping behind, but we'll kind of touch on that more in the review portion. So the geometry on this bike, I actually felt pretty comfortable, pretty at home. The numbers we will obviously flash up here on the screen. If you want to go to theloamwolf.com, we will have a full geo chart of this bike as well as all the other bikes in the shootout, so you can really kind of get in there and crunch all those numbers up close and see which ones matter and suit you the best. With that said, let's get this thing out on the trails.
Solid. I quite like this motor for the not super steep stuff. It feels like it gives you a good push. Yeah, haven't ridden it up anything super steep yet, so still waiting to figure that bit out.
Where does this bike stand out to you? What were some of the exciting features that you really liked about it?
In terms of features, I think the SRAM powertrain system is very well integrated. I think they do a good job with the overall package. Having the auto shift technology option in there, I think is great. Although I didn't love how it actually performs when you're on the trails, which we'll get into in a little bit. Looks great and rides very silently. I think this is one of the quieter bikes on test, which really adds to the overall feeling of quality.
Sean, any performance standouts, areas that you didn't love the bike?
I felt that climbing the bike on flatter terrain, the SRAM motor was equally as fast as everything else, and it has 90 Newton meters of torque, so you would think that it would be blowing past everything else aside from our Rocky Mountain. But I felt that once you started going up steeper grade, that the motor kind of pulled back a little bit and just didn't offer as much assist as some of the other models.
Yeah, I kept going back and forth on this drive unit. There would be moments where I would be like, dude, this is a rocket ship, and it would take off, and then I would approach a certain aspect of the climb or a certain pitch, and then all of a sudden I would feel like, whoa, like those guys are pulling away from me, or they're catching back up, or my legs are getting more fatigued putting effort in than on the other bike. And you are thinking, right, like, oh, this should have more power, but then we would stop and film a section, right? And I would turn around at the bottom of like a vertical climb that I wasn't coming into with momentum. And I would just start out slow because traction was scarce. And I was like, oh wow, this thing is just crawling up there. And then I was like, that actually felt better than the other bikes I just filmed the same climbing segment on. So I think maybe the big takeaway I learned is that cadence and gear selection are very dependent on how powerful this drive unit seems.
Absolutely.
Because it can feel faster and it can feel slower at the same time.
And that cadence dependence, I think, is towards the lower end of the scale, right? It seems to do better at the really cranking a hard gear sort of cadence rather than spinning at a super high cadence like some of the other systems favor. And I wonder, that I feel like that gives a slightly less natural feeling overall, perhaps. It is more, yeah, you need to pedal it in a harder gear for it to use that torque rather than spinning at a higher RPM to get peak power out of it.
Well, let's talk about the shifting.
Okay, yeah, auto shift is an interesting technology that's coming in. Both Shimano and SRAM are now offering it on specific electronic drivetrain systems with their motors. In both cases actually, but we'll talk about this, you're able to fine-tune the cadence preference that the system is trying to target you towards. So on this you can set it between plus and minus 3 to change the cadence that it's trying to get you to maintain comfortably. And I find that if you go into the lower cadences, it's very easy to bog the motor down, and then as you get higher and higher cadence towards what I find more natural, there was so many times that I'd go to pedal and it would be in too low of a gear and there'd be no kind of feeling of support under the pedals, which makes you, feel like the chain's almost falling off or something's up, and you kind of have that moment where your leg's just falling away with nothing underneath it. So I could never find a balance in the system that made me comfortable for the whole time, and I just ended up turning it off because, I mean, I'm not stranger to changing gear and optimizing the cadence for me because we ride a lot of bikes.
Sean, rally and range mode, only having 2 options for power. I know we normally are all boost all the time sort of riders, but did that ever bother you? Could you see that being an issue? Did you like the simplicity of just setting it and go?
I don't think it's an issue. I mean, but we are riders who spend 99% of our time in boost, and we would only switch to a lower gear if we were running lower on battery. So I mean, the 2 modes, it's not a big deal breaker to me.
Okay.
I mean, and if it were a different drive system, I feel like most of the time we're either in tour or trail to get that extra battery life anyways. So rather similar.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess for us it's very rare that we're going to be in a full eco ride on a big battery capacity e-bike. 720 watt hours in this thing. It does take you a long way if you're in eco mode, and we'd run out of time before we got to the end of that battery life if we were in eco.
All right, moving on to the performance. This bike obviously favors the descents. So let's talk about how the bike rides, handles, and goes downhill. Sean?
I felt that the rear end was a bit on the stiffer side of things.
Suspension or frame?
Both.
Okay.
It definitely requires more pushing into it, I think, a more aggressive ride feel. But that said, it still handled a lot of what we threw at it this week pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd second that. I do think it's not a super plush and sensitive off the top kind of bike, especially given it's got the Vivid, which normally would, push that characteristic that extra little bit on these bikes. It's by no means super uncomfortable and jarring. It's got 170mm rear travel, so of course there's still plenty of wheel movement helping to keep things comfortable. But yeah, as 170mm travel bikes go, it's definitely on the more supportive kind of side, I'd say. Talking about the geometry, I think that's something that's quite interesting. It's pretty slack in the front, quite long in the rear for a mixed wheel bike, but then also very tall in the stack. And I think some of us had some issues at times just keeping enough weight on that front wheel, even though that you do have that long rear end offset in it. I think you talked about that, especially on the way up the hill.
For sure, yeah. There was a bit of struggle for me. Obviously, playing with steer tube spacers can alter the both comfort feel on the bike as well as weight distribution on the bike. So, but it does have the tallest stack of any bike here in the shootout, and that was definitely noticeable both weighting the front end in corners and especially on steep climbs. So tall stack riders will be happy, and those who maybe like having a little bit more weight distribution over the front end might want to be slamming that front end. But
of course, the flip side of the tall stack height is your weight is pushed slightly higher and further back, which gives you a little bit more of a confident stance for the steeper bits of trail. We've not ridden a huge amount of steep stuff this week, but back home we took it on a couple of steeper bits of trail, and it was definitely appreciated. And this is a very confident machine that you can really charge on.
I would say riders that maybe like flow trails are going to really enjoy this over something like the range, because you get that little bit of push out of a berm, off of a lip. If you're pumping rollers, wanting to pre-hop stuff, this bike comes off the ground, I think, a bit easier than some of those.
Absolutely, it'd be a total bike park weapon. It's also under 52 pounds, so a pretty respectable weight overall for a bike in this category.
Yeah.
And yeah, certainly bike park machine, more flow trail killer. They'll still absolutely handle the rough stuff, just maybe not with quite as much comfort and poise as the likes of the Norco.
Okay. Who do you think the ideal consumer for this bike is?
Somebody that likes to ride hard. I mean, you guys also just said that bike park is a good spot, so flow trails, berms, big jumps, and then, yeah, just steeper, rockier, gnarlier section of trail probably.
Yeah, I think bigger, chunkier trails open up the suspension more because you're repeatedly hitting bigger impacts. I think it's kind of like that smaller, like 2 to 3 inch size stuff that can start to fatigue a little bit on the higher speed stuff when it's spaced out. But when you kind of get into like backcountry descents, where you're just like riding scree fields or like really gnarly chunk, obviously outside of bike park stuff where we all already agreed this bike excels. I think the bike still does very well in those scenarios and can absolutely be a good big mountain backcountry EMTB for sure. Overall, very solid bike from Propain in the Ekano CF, and one that we've really liked. Make sure you guys stay tuned for the grand finale where you can see how this bike fared against the 14 EMTBs in this year's shootout. Thanks again to Schwalbe and Fox Racing, and of course Howler Bike Park for hosting us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you out on the trails.